Imagine standing on a street corner in Los Angeles. To your left, a luxury dealership displays a car worth $300,000, a toy for the ultra-wealthy. To your right, a tent city stretches down the block, where an entire family survives on less than $10 a day. This is a defining image of the American economy in 2026. Extreme opulence colliding with extreme destitution. We are living in a timeline where a single individual can lose 99% of their net worth and still be a billionaire, while nearly 800,000 Americans don't have a roof over their heads tonight. The math suggests that we could solve this humanitarian crisis with what amounts to a rounding error in the portfolios of the elite. But if the solution is that simple, why haven't we done it? Is it really just about the money, or are we missing the bigger picture? The scale of the crisis. To understand whether taxing billionaires is the silver bullet for homelessness, we first have to understand the sheer scale of the playing field. We are not talking about rich people who fly first class. We are talking about a class of wealth that functions like a sovereign nation. As of January 2026, the collective wealth of America's 935 billionaires has hit a staggering $8.1 trillion. To put that into perspective, that is more than the GDP of Germany and Japan combined. In just the last 12 months, the top 15 billionaires, those with over $100 billion each, saw their fortunes swell by 33%, adding nearly $1 trillion to their ledgers, while the S&P 500 grew at half that rate. On the other side of this ledger lies the homelessness crisis. According to the 2024 point-in-time count, approximately 771,000 people in the United States are experiencing homelessness. This is the highest number on record. It includes 150,000 children and tens of thousands of veterans who served this country only to be left behind by it. The crisis is visible in every major city, from the subway tunnels of New York to the encampments of San Francisco. It is a humanitarian disaster occurring in the wealthiest nation in human history. The central question of our time has become unavoidable. In a country with $8.1 trillion sequestered at the very top, why is anyone sleeping on the pavement? The math, a drop in the bucket. Let's look at the raw numbers, because they are genuinely shocking. How much would it actually cost to end homelessness? Not just to manage it, but to end it? Estimates vary, but a widely cited figure from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, suggests that roughly $20 to $30 billion annually could functionally end homelessness by providing universal housing vouchers and rapid rehousing support. That sounds like a massive sum until you compare it to the wealth we just discussed. If we take the upper estimate of $30 billion, that represents just 0.37% of the total wealth held by U.S. billionaires. That is less than half of 1%. Theoretically, you could levy a one-time solidarity tax of 1% on billionaire assets, raise $81 billion, and fully fund homelessness initiatives for nearly 3 years. You wouldn't even need to touch the principal. You could fund this entirely off the interest and capital gains generated in a single good quarter. For a man like Elon Musk, whose net worth recently surpassed $700 billion, contributing his share to this fund will be the mathematical equivalent of the average American buying a cup of coffee. The argument for a wealth tax is incredibly seductive because the arithmetic is so clean. The money exists, it is concentrated in fewer than 1,000 hands, and transferring a microscopic fraction of it could save hundreds of thousands of lives. The California paradox. Why money isn't always the answer. However, if we're going to be honest about this debate, we have to look at where the just spend more money argument hits a brick wall. There is no better example of this complexities than California. The Golden State is home to 30% of the nation's homeless population, about 171,000 people, and it is also home to some of the most aggressive spending on the issue. Between 2018 and 2023, California spent a staggering $24 billion on homelessness and housing programs. That is a massive injection of capital, roughly equal to the GDP of Iceland. And yet, in that same period, homelessness in California didn't vanish. It arguably got worse. A blistering state audit released in 2024 found that despite this historic spending, the state failed to consistently track outcomes. They couldn't definitively say which programs worked and which didn't. This phenomenon, often called the California paradox, provides the strongest ammunition for billionaire defenders. They argue that the problem isn't a lack of funds, it's a lack of competence. If you tax billionaires and pour another $20 billion into a broken system that prioritizes bureaucracy over beds, you aren't solving homelessness. You're just subsidizing a homelessness industrial complex. Critics point out that money often gets swallowed up by administrative costs, legal battles, and the incredibly high cost of building affordable housing. In cities like Los Angeles, building a single unit supportive housing can cost upwards of $800,000 due to zoning laws, environmental reviews, and labor costs. At that rate, even a wealth tax generating billions will be drained quickly with minimal impact. This suggests that while revenue is necessary, it is insufficient. Without structural reform in zoning, mental health care, and drug rehabilitation, a blank check might just bounce. The liquidity defense. It's not a Scrooge McDuck vault. There's another technical hurdle that often gets glossed over in the tax-the-rich rhetoric: the nature of billionaire wealth. When we say Jeff Bezos or Larry Ellison is worth $200 billion, we don't mean they have $200 billion sitting in a checking account. Their wealth is tied up in assets, specifically stock in the companies they founded. It is unrealized wealth. To pay a multi-billion-dollar tax bill, they would have to sell huge chunks of Amazon or Oracle stock. Economic purists warn that forced selling on this scale could crash stock prices, hurting not just the billionaires, but also the retirement accounts of average Americans who hold these stocks in their 401(k)s. They argue that wealth taxes effectively punish capital investment. If you force the innovators to liquidate their control over their companies to pay the government, you might stifle the very economic engine that creates jobs. Furthermore, billionaires are highly mobile. We have seen examples in Europe where wealth taxes led to capital flight, where the rich simply move their assets to tax-friendly jurisdictions, leaving the country with less revenue than before. The fear is that a U.S. wealth tax could send $8.1 trillion fleeing to Singapore or Switzerland. The counter-argument. Despite these economic concerns, the data on the ground tells a different story about the cost-effectiveness of direct intervention. We have concrete evidence that leaving people on the street is actually more expensive than housing them. This is where the housing-first model comes in. Studies from the Urban Institute have shown that when you provide unconditional permanent housing with supportive services, you dramatically reduce the taxpayer burden on emergency rooms, jails, and police interventions. In a landmark study in Denver, providing supportive housing to the chronically homeless saved the city nearly $7,000 per person per year in public service costs. These savings offset about half the cost of the housing program itself. When you factor in human potential, people returning to the workforce, paying taxes, and rejoining their families, the return on investment is positive. This dismantles the idea that we can't afford to act. The reality is, we are already paying for homelessness. We are just paying for it in the least efficient way possible, through ambulance rides and incarceration, rather than through housing. A targeted wealth tax could pivot this funding model from reactive crisis management to proactive stability. The policy proposal. How a tax could actually work. So, how do we bridge the gap between the unrealized gains problem and the need for funding? Policy experts have proposed nuanced solutions that avoid the liquidity trap. One proposal is a wealth proceeds tax, or a tax on borrowing against assets. Currently, billionaires often avoid income tax by taking low-interest loans against their stock holdings to fund their lifestyle, paying zero tax on that money because debt isn't income. Closing this buy, borrow, die loophole could generate billions without forcing a market crash. Another option gaining traction is a global minimum tax on billionaires, a concept pushed by economists like Gabriel Zuckman and supported by the G20 debates. A 2% annual minimum tax on the world's 3,000 billionaires could raise nearly $250 billion a year globally. For the U.S., even a modest 1% tax on net wealth above $50 million is estimated to raise $200 billion annually. Even if we assume 50% of that is loss of evasion or capital flight, a pessimistic estimate, that still leaves $100 billion a year. That is 5 times the estimated cost to end homelessness in America. The money is there. The mechanisms to get it are there. The missing variable is political will. The structural necessity, beyond the money, if we successfully levied this tax and secured the $20 billion a year, what would the roadmap look like? It can't just be handouts. The most successful models, like Finland's Housing First policy, combine housing with aggressive social services. Finland is the only country in the EU where homelessness is falling, and they did it by virtually eliminating shelters in favor of permanent rental apartments. They didn't just throw money at the problem. They changed the architecture of the system. For the U.S. to replicate this, the revenue from a billionaire tax would need to be ring-fenced specifically for 3 things: construction of low-income housing to bypass the private market failure, universal rental assistance vouchers so no one pays more than 30% of their income on rent, and a massive expansion of mental health and addiction treatment infrastructure. Currently, the U.S. mental health system is a ghost of what it needs to be. You cannot house a person who is fighting severe schizophrenia without support. They will fall back through the cracks. The tax revenue would need to fund not just the bricks and mortar, but the salaries of thousands of social workers, nurses, and counselors. The moral argument versus the economic reality. Ultimately, the debate boils down to a question of values versus logistics. The economic reality is that billionaires have accumulated wealth at a rate that defies historical precedent, fueled by a system that taxes labor heavier than capital. The top 0.1% now own about the same amount of wealth as the bottom 90%. When a society reaches this level of stratification, the social contract begins to fray. We see the consequences in the rise of populism, social unrest, and yes, in the tent cities lining our boulevards. Opponents argue that billionaires earn their wealth and that seizing it is theft. They argue that the government has proven itself a poor steward of capital, citing the California audit as proof that more money will just be wasted. And they are partially right. Without accountability, money is useless. But proponents argue that the existence of billionaires in the same zip codes as starving children is a policy failure. They argue that an economy is a tool to serve society, not the other way around. If the economy produces $8.1 trillion of surplus at the top and misery at the bottom, the tool is broken. Conclusion, the verdict. So, should we tax billionaires to end homelessness? The data suggests the answer is a qualified yes. The math is undeniable. A fraction of the wealth currently hoarded at the top could technically fund the housing of every homeless person in America 10 times over. The liquidity and economic damage arguments, while valid concerns, are manageable with smart policy design like closing borrowing loopholes or implementing minimum taxes. However, the yes comes with a massive asterisk. Taxation is the fuel, but it is not the engine. If we tax billionaires tomorrow and dump that money into the current dysfunctional, bureaucratic, NIMBY-restricted housing market, we will burn billions with little to show for it. The solution requires a dual approach. A fearless redistribution of resources funded by the ultra-wealthy, paired with a ruthless overhaul of how we build housing and treat mental illness. We have the resources. We have the blueprints from countries like Finland. The only thing we are lacking is a collective courage to disrupt the status quo. Until we decide that human dignity is worth more than a protected portfolio, the tents will remain, and the billionaires will get richer. The choice, ultimately, is ours.